Chapter 9 of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 9 The Meeting in the Desert. Now I do not propose to describe all our journey to Kenderland, or at any rate the first part thereof. It was interesting enough in its way and we met with a few hunting adventures, also some others. But there is so much to tell of what happened to us after we reached the place that I have not the time, even if I had the inclination, to set all these matters down. Let it be sufficient, then, to say that although owing to political events the country happened to be rather disturbed at the time, we trekked through Zululand without any great difficulty. For here my name was a power in the land and all parties united to help me. Thence too I managed to dispatch 3 messengers, half-bred border men, lean fellows and swift of foot, forward to the king of the Mazitu, as Hans had suggested that I should do, advising him that his old friends Macumazana, Watcher by Night, and the yellow man who was named Light in Darkness and Lord of the Fire were about to visit him again. As I knew we could not take the wagons beyond a certain point where there was a river called the Luba, unfordable by anything on wheels, I requested him moreover to send 100 bearers with whatever escort might be necessary to meet us on the banks of that river at a spot which was known to both of us. These words the messengers promised to deliver for a fee of 5 head of cattle apiece, to be paid on their return, or to their families if they died on the road, which cattle we purchased and left in charge of a chief who was their kinsman. As it happened, 2 of the poor fellows did die, one of them of cold in a swamp through which they took a short cut, and the other at the teeth of a hungry lion. The third, however, won through and delivered the message. After resting for a fortnight in the northern parts of Zululand, to give time to our way-worn oxen to get some flesh on their bones in the warm bushveld where grass was plentiful even in the dry season, we trekked forward by a route known to Hans and myself. Indeed, it was the same which we had followed on our journey from Mazituland after our expedition in search for the Holy Flower. We took with us a small army of Zulu bearers. This, although they were difficult to feed in a country where no corn could be bought, proved fortunate in the end, since so many of our cattle died from tsetse bite that we were obliged to abandon one of the wagons, which meant that the goods it contained must be carried by men. At length we reached the banks of the river and camped there one night by 3 tall peaks of rock which the natives called the 3 Doctors, where I had instructed the messengers to tell the Mazitu to meet us. For 4 days we remained here, since rains in the interior had made the river quite impassable. Every morning I climbed the tallest of the Doctors and with my glasses looked over its broad yellow flood, searching the wide bush-clad land beyond in the hope of discovering the Mazitu advancing to meet us. Not a man was to be seen, however, and on the 4th evening, as the river had now become fordable, we determined that we would cross on the morrow, leaving the remaining wagon, which it was impossible to drag over its rocky bottom, to be taken back to Natal by our drivers. Here a difficulty arose. No promise of reward would induce any of our Zulu bearers even to wet their feet in the waters of this river Luba, which for some reason that I could not extract from them, they declared to be tagati, that is bewitched, to people of their blood. When I pointed out that 3 Zulus had already undertaken to cross it, they answered that those men were half-breeds, so that for them it was only half bewitched, but they thought that even so one or more of them would pay the penalty of death for this rash crime. It chanced that this happened, for, as I have said, 2 of the poor fellows did die, though not, I think, owing to the magical properties of the waters of the Luba. This is how African superstitions are kept alive. Sooner or later some saying of any sort fulfills itself, and then the instance is remembered and handed down for generations, while other instances in which nothing out of the common has occurred are not heeded or are forgotten. This decision on the part of those stupid Zulus put us in an awkward fix, since it was impossible for us to carry over all our baggage and ammunition without help. Therefore glad was I when before dawn on the 5th morning the nocturnal Hans crept into the wagon, in the after part of which Ragnall and I were sleeping, and informed us that he heard men's voices on the farther side of the river, though how he could hear anything above that roar of water passed my comprehension. At the first break of dawn again we climbed the tallest of the Doctor rocks and stared into the mist. At length it rolled away, and there on the far side of the river I saw quite 100 men, who by their dress and spears I knew to be Mazitu. They saw me also and, raising a cheer, dashed into the water, groups of them holding each other round the middle to prevent their being swept away. Thereupon our silly Zulus seized their spears and formed up upon the bank. I slid down the steep side of the great Doctor and ran forward, calling out that these were friends who came. "Friends or foes," answered their captain sullenly, "it is a pity that we should walk so far and not have a fight with these Mazitu dogs." Well, I drove them off to a distance, not knowing what might happen if the two peoples met, and then went down to the bank. By now the Mazitu were near, and to my delight at the head of them I perceived no other than my old friend, their chief general Babemba, a one-eyed man with whom Hans and I had shared many adventures. Through the water he plunged with great bounds and reaching the shore greeted me literally with rapture. "O Macumazana," he said, "little did I hope that ever again I should look upon your face. Welcome to you, 1,000 welcomes, and to you too, Light in Darkness, Lord of the Fire, cunning one whose wit saved us in the Battle of the Gate. But where is Dogeetah? Where is Wazela? And where are the Mother and Child of the Flower?" "Far away across the black water, Babemba," I answered, "but here are two others in place of them," and I introduced him to Ragnall and Savage by their native names of Igeza and Bena. He contemplated them for a moment, then said: "This," pointing to Ragnall, "is a great lord, but this," pointing to Savage, who was much better dressed of the two, "is a cock of the ashpit arrayed in an eagle's feathers," a remark I did not translate, but one which caused Hans to snigger vacuously. While we breakfasted on food prepared by the "cock of the ashpit," who amongst many other merits had that of being an excellent cook, I heard all the news. Bausi the king was dead, but had been succeeded by one of his sons, also named Bausi, whom I remembered. Beza town had been rebuilt after the great fire that destroyed the slavers, and much more strongly fortified than before. Of the slavers themselves nothing more had been seen, or of the Pongo either, though the Mazitu declared that their ghosts, or those of their victims, still haunted the island of the lake. That was all, except the ill tidings as to two of our messengers, which the third, who had returned with the Mazitu, reported to us. After breakfast I addressed and sent away our Zulus, each with a handsome present from the trade goods, giving into their charge the remaining wagons and our servants, none of whom, somewhat to my relief, wished to accompany us further. They sang their song of goodbye, saluted and departed over the rise, still looking hungrily behind them at the Mazitu, and we were very pleased to see the last of them without bloodshed or trouble. When we had watched the white tilt of the wagon vanish, we set to work to get ourselves and our goods across the river. This we accomplished safely, for the Mazitu worked for us like friends and not as do hired men. On the farther bank, however, it took us 2 full days to divide up the loads so that the bearers could carry them without being overladen. At length all was arranged and we started. Of the month's trek that followed there is nothing to tell, except that we completed it without notable accidents and at last reached the new Beza town, which much resembled the old, where we were accorded a great public reception. Bausi too himself headed the procession which met us outside the south gate on that very mound which we had occupied in the great fight, where the bones of the gallant Mavovo and my other hunters lay buried. Almost did it seem to me as though I could hear their deep voices joining in the shouts of welcome. That night, while the Mazitu feasted in our honour, we held an indaba in the big new guest house with Bausi too, a pleasant-faced young man, and the old Babemba. The king asked us how long we meant to stay at Beza town, intimating his hope that the visit would be prolonged. I replied but a few days, as we were travelling far to the north to find a people called the Kendah whom we wished to see, and hoped that he would give us bearers to carry our goods as far as the confines of their country. At the name of Kendah a look of astonishment appeared upon their faces, and Babemba said: "Has madness seized you, Macumazana, that you would attempt this thing? Oh, surely you must be mad." "You thought us mad, Babemba, when we crossed the lake to Rica town, yet we came back safely." "True, Macumazana, but compared to the Kendah the Pongo were but as the smallest star before the face of the sun." "What do you know of them then?" I asked. "But stay, before you answer, I will speak what I know," and I repeated what I had learned from Hans, who confirmed my words, and from Harût and Marût, leaving out, however, any mention of their dealings with Lady Ragnall. "It is all true," said Babemba when I had finished, "for that old woman of whom Light in Darkness speaks was one of the wives of my uncle and I knew her well. Hearken. These Kendah are a terrible nation and countless in number and of all the people the fiercest. Their king is called Simba, which means lion. He who rules is always called Simba and has been so called for hundreds of years. He is of the Black Kendah whose god is the elephant Jana. But as Light in Darkness has said, there are also the White Kendah who are Arab men, the priests and traders of the people. The Kendah will allow no stranger within their doors. If one comes they kill him by torment or blind him and turn him out into the desert which surrounds their country, there to die. These things the old woman who married my uncle told me, as she told them to Light in Darkness. Also I have heard them from others, and what she did not tell me, that the White Kendah are great breeders of the beasts called camels, which they sell to the Arabs of the north. Go not near them, for if you pass the desert the Black Kendah will kill you, and if you escape these, then their king Simba will kill you, and if you escape him, then the god Jana will kill you, and if you escape him, then their white priests will kill you with their magic. Oh, long before you look upon the faces of those priests you will be dead many times over." "Then why did they ask me to visit them, Babemba?" "I know not, Macumazana, but perhaps because they wish to make an offering of you to the god Jana, whom no spear can harm, no, nor even your bullets that pierce a tree." "I am willing to make trial of that matter," I answered confidently, "and anyway we must go to see these things for ourselves." "Yes," echoed Ragnall, "we must certainly go," while even Savage, for I had been translating to them all this while, nodded his head although he looked as though he would much rather stay behind. "Ask him if there are any snakes there, sir," he said, and foolishly enough I put the question to give me time to think of other things. "Yes, O Bena, yes, O Cock of the Ashpit," replied Babemba. "My uncle's Kendah wife told me that one of the guardians of the shrine of the White Kendah is such a snake as was never seen elsewhere in the world." "Then say to him, sir," said Savage, when I had translated almost automatically, "that shrine ain't a church where I shall go to say my prayers." Alas, poor Savage little knew the future and its gifts. Then we came to the question of bearers. The end of it was that after some hesitation Bausi too, because of his great affection for us, promised to provide us with these upon our solemnly undertaking to dismiss them at the borders of the desert, so that they might escape our doom, as he remarked cheerfully. 4 days later we started, accompanied by about 120 picked men under the command of old Babemba himself, who, he explained, wished to be the last to see us alive in the world. This was depressing, but other circumstances connected with our start were calculated to weigh even more upon my spirit. Thus the night before we left Hans arrived and asked me to write a paper for him. I inquired what he wanted me to put in the paper. He replied that as he was going to his death and had property, namely the £650 that had been left in a bank to his credit. He desired to make a "white man's will" to be left in the charge of Babemba. The only provision of the said will was that I was to inherit his property if I lived. If I died, which, he added, "of course you must, Baas, like the rest of us," it was to be devoted to furnishing poor black people in hospital with something comforting to drink instead of the "cow's water" that was given to them there. Needless to say, I turned him out at once, and that testamentary disposition remains unrecorded. Indeed, it was unnecessary, since, as I reminded him, on my advice he had already made a will before we left Durban, a circumstance that he had quite forgotten. The second event which occurred about an hour before our departure was that, hearing a mighty wailing in the market-place, where once Hans and I had been tied to stakes to be shot to death with arrows, I went out to see what was the matter. At the gateway I was greeted by the sight of about 100 old women plastered all over with ashes, engaged in howling their loudest in a melancholy unison. Behind these stood the entire population of Beza Town, who chanted a kind of chorus. "What the devil are they doing?" I asked of Hans. "Singing our death song, Baas," he replied stolidly, "as they say that where we are going no one will take the trouble to do so, and it is not right that great lords should die and the heavens above remain uninformed that they are coming." "That's cheerful," I remarked, and wheeling round, asked Ragnall straight out if he wished to persevere in this business, for to tell the truth my nerve was shaken. "I must," he answered simply, "but there is no reason why you and Hans should, or Savage either, for the matter of that." "Oh, I am going where you go," I said, "and where I go Hans will go. Savage must speak for himself." This he did and to the same effect, being a very honest and faithful man. It was the more to his credit since, as he informed me in private, he did not enjoy African adventure and often dreamed at nights of his comfortable room at Ragnall, whence he superintended the social activities of that great establishment. So we departed and marched for a matter of a month or more through every kind of country. After we had passed the head of the great lake, wherein lay the island, if it really was an island, where the Pongo used to dwell, one clear morning through my glasses I discerned the mountain top that marked the former residence of the Mother of the Flower, and by contrast it made me feel quite homesick. We struck up north, following a route known to Babemba and our guides. After this we steered by the stars through a land with very few inhabitants, timid and nondescript folk who dwelt in scattered villages and scarcely understood the art of cultivating the soil, even in its most primitive form. 100 miles or so further on these villages ceased, and thenceforward we only encountered some nomads, little bushmen who lived on game which they shot with poisoned arrows. Once they attacked us and killed 2 of the Mazitu with those horrid arrows, against the venom of which no remedy that we had in our medicine chest proved of any avail. On this occasion Savage exhibited his courage if not his discretion, for rushing out of our thorn fence, after missing a bushman with both barrels at a distance of 5 yards, he was, I think, the worst shot I ever saw. He seized the little viper with his hands and dragged him back to camp. How Savage escaped with his life I do not know, for one poisoned arrow went through his hat and stuck in his hair, and another just grazed his leg without drawing blood. This valorous deed was of great service to us, since we were able through Hans, who knew something of the bushman's language, to explain to our prisoner that if we were shot at again he would be hung. This information he contrived to shout, or rather to squeak and grunt, to his amiable tribe, of which it appeared he was a kind of chief, with the result that we were no more molested. Later, when we were clear of the Bushman country, we let him depart, which he did with great rapidity. By degrees the land grew more and more barren and utterly devoid of inhabitants, till at last it merged into desert. At the edge of this desert, which rolled away without apparent limit, we came, however, to a kind of oasis where there was a strong and beautiful spring of water that formed a stream which soon lost itself in the surrounding sand. As we could go no further, for even if we wished to do so and were able to find water there, the Mazitu refused to accompany us into the desert. Not knowing what else to do, we camped in the oasis and waited. As it happened, the place was a kind of hunter's paradise, since every kind of game, large and small, came to the water to drink at night, and in the daytime browsed upon the saltish grass that at this season of the year grew plentifully upon the edge of the wilderness. Amongst other creatures there were elephants in plenty that travelled hither out of the bushlands we had passed, or sometimes emerged from the desert itself, suggesting that beyond this waste there lay fertile country. So numerous were these great beasts indeed that for my part I hoped earnestly that it would prove impossible for us to continue our journey, since I saw that in a few months I could collect an enormous amount of ivory, enough to make me comparatively rich, if only I were able to get it away. As it was, we only killed a few of them, 10 in all to be accurate, that we might send back the tusks as presents to Bausi II. To slaughter the poor animals uselessly was cruel, especially as being unaccustomed to the sight of man they were as easy to approach as cows. Even Savage slew one by carefully aiming at another 5 paces to its left. For the rest we lived on the fat of the land and, as meat was necessary to us, had as much sport as we could desire amongst the various antelope. For 14 days or so this went on, till at length we grew thoroughly tired of the business, as did the Mazitu, who were so gorged with flesh that they began to desire vegetable food. Twice we rode as far into the desert as we dared, for our horses remained to us and had grown fresh again after the rest, but only to return without information. The place was just a vast wilderness strewn with brown stones beautifully polished by the wind-driven sand of ages, and quite devoid of water. After our second trip, on which we suffered severely from thirst, we held a consultation. Old Babemba said that he could keep his men no longer even for us, as they insisted upon returning home, and inquired what we meant to do and why we sat here like a stone. I answered that we were waiting for some of the Kendah who had bid me to shoot game hereabouts until they arrived to be our guides. He remarked that the Kendah, to the best of his belief, lived in a country that was still hundreds of miles away, and that, as they did not know of our presence, any communications across the desert being impossible, our proceedings seemed to be foolish. I retorted that I was not quite so sure of this, since the Kendah seemed to have remarkable ways of acquiring information. "Then, Macumazana, I fear that you will have to wait by yourselves until you discover which of us is right," he said stolidly. Turning to Ragnall, I asked him what he would do, pointing out that to journey into the desert meant death, especially as we did not know whither we were going, and that to return alone, without the stores which we must abandon, through the country of the Bushmen to Mazituland, would also be a risky proceeding. However, it was for him to decide. Now he grew much perturbed. Taking me apart again, he dwelt earnestly upon his secret reasons for wishing to visit these Kendah, with which of course I was already acquainted, as indeed was Savage. "I desire to stay here," he ended, "which means that we must all stay, Ragnall, since Savage will not desert you, nor will Hans desert me, although he thinks us mad. He points out that I came to seek ivory, and hereabout is ivory in plenty for the trouble of taking." "I might remain alone, Quatermain," he began, but I looked at him in such a way that he never finished the sentence. Ultimately we came to a compromise. Babemba, on behalf of the Mazitu, agreed to wait 3 more days. If nothing happened during that period, we on our part agreed to return with them to a stretch of well-watered bush about 50 miles behind us, which we knew swarmed with elephants, that by now were growing shy of approaching our oasis where there was so much noise and shooting. There we would kill as much ivory as we could carry, an operation in which they were willing to assist for the fun of it, and then go back with them to Mazituland. 3 days went by, and with every hour that passed my spirits rose, as did those of Savage and Hans, while Lord Ragnall became more and more depressed. The third afternoon was devoted to a jubilant packing of loads, for in accordance with the terms of our bargain we were to start backwards on our spoor at dawn upon the morrow. Most happily did I lay myself down to sleep in my little bough shelter that night, feeling that at last I was rid of an uncommonly awkward adventure. If I thought that we could do any good by staying on, it would have been another matter, but as I was certain that there was no earthly chance of our finding among the Kendah, if ever we reached them, the lady who had tumbled in the Nile in Egypt, well, I was glad that Providence had been so good as to make it impossible for us to commit suicide by thirst in a desert, or otherwise. For, notwithstanding my former reasonings to the contrary, I was now convinced that this is what had happened to poor Ragnall's wife. That, however, was just what Providence had not done. In the middle of the night, to be precise at exactly 2 in the morning, I was awakened by Hans, who slept at the back of my shanty, into which he had crept through a hole in the faggots, exclaiming in a frightened voice: "Open your eyes and look, Baas. There are 2 spooks waiting to see you outside, Baas." Very cautiously I lifted myself a little and stared out into the moonlight. There, seated about 5 paces from the open end of the hut, were the spooks sure enough, 2 white-robed figures squatting silent and immovable upon the ground. At first I was frightened. Then I bethought me of thieves and felt for my Colt pistol under the rug that served me as a pillow. As I got hold of the handle, however, a deep voice said: "Is it your custom, O Macumazana, watcher by night, to receive guests with bullets?" Now, thought I to myself, who is there in the world who could see a man catch hold of the handle of a pistol in the recesses of a dark place and under a blanket at night, except the owner of that voice which I seemed to remember hearing in a certain drawing room in England? "Yes, Harût," I answered with an unconcerned yawn, "when the guests come in such a doubtful fashion and in the middle of the night. But as you are here at last, will you be so good as to tell us why you have kept us waiting all this time? Is that your way of fulfilling an engagement?" "O Lord Macumazana," answered Harût, for of course it was he, in quite a perturbed tone, "I offer to you our humble apologies. The truth is that when we heard of your arrival at Beza Town we started, or tried to start, from hundreds of miles away to keep our tryst with you here as we promised we would do. But we are mortal, Macumazana, and accidents intervened. Thus, when we had ascertained the weight of your baggage, camels had to be collected to carry it, which were grazing at a distance. Also it was necessary to send forward to dig out a certain well in the desert where they must drink. Hence the delay. Still you will admit that we have arrived in time, 5 or at any rate 4 hours before the rising of that sun which was to light you on your homeward way." "Yes, you have, O prophets, or O liars, whichever you may be," I exclaimed with pardonable exasperation, for really their knowledge of my private affairs, however obtained, was enough to anger a saint. "So as you are here at last, come in and have a drink, for whether you are men or devils you must be cold out there in the damp." In they came accordingly and, not being Mohammedans, partook of a tot of square face from a bottle which I kept locked in a box to put Hans beyond the reach of temptation. "To your health, Harût and Marût," I said, drinking a little out of the pannikin and giving the rest to Hans, who gulped the fiery liquor down with a smack of his lips. For I will admit that I joined in this unholy midnight potation to gain time for thought and to steady my nerve. "To your health, O Lord Macumazana," the pair answered as they swallowed their tots, which I had made pretty stiff, and set down their pannikins in front of them with as much reverence as though these had been holy vessels. "Now," I said, throwing a blanket over my shoulders, for the air was chilly, "now let us talk." And taking the lantern which Hans had thoughtfully lighted, I held it up and contemplated them. There they were, Harût and Marût without doubt, to all appearance totally unchanged since some years before I had seen them at Ragnall in England. "What are you doing here?" I asked in a kind of fiery indignation inspired by intense curiosity. "How did you get out of England after you had tried to steal away the lady to whom you sent the necklace? What did you do with that lady after you had beguiled her from the boat of Abu Simbel? In the name of your Holy Child, or of Shaitan of the Mohammedans, or of Set of the Egyptians, answer me, lest I should make an end of both of you, which I can do here without any questions being asked," and I whipped out my pistol. "Pardon us," said Harût with a grave smile, "but if you were to do as you say, Lord Macumazana, many questions would be asked which you might find hard to answer. So be pleased to put that death dealer back into its place and to tell us before we reply to you what you know of Set of the Egyptians." "As much or as little as you do," I replied. Both bowed as though this information were of the most satisfactory order. Then Harût went on: "In reply to your requests, O Macumazana, we left England by a steamboat and in due course after long journeyings we reached our own country. We do not understand your allusions to a place called Abu Simbel on the Nile, whence never having been there we have taken no lady. Indeed, we never meant to take that lady to whom we sent a necklace in England. We only meant to ask certain questions of her, as she had the gift of vision, when you appeared and interrupted us. What should we want with white ladies, who already have far too many of our own?" "I don't know," I replied, "but I do know that you are the biggest liars I ever met." At these words, which some might have thought insulting, Harût and Marût bowed again as though to acknowledge a great compliment. Then Harût said: "Let us leave the question of ladies and come to matters that have to do with men. You are here as we told you that you would be at a time when you did not believe us, and we here to meet you, as we told you that we would be. How we knew that you were coming and how we came do not matter at all. Believe what you will. Are you ready to start with us, O Lord Macumazana, that you may bring to its death the wicked elephant Jana which ravages our land, and receive the great reward of ivory? If so, your camel awaits." "One camel cannot carry 4 men," I answered, avoiding the question. "In courage and skill you are more than many men, O Macumazana, yet in body you are but one and not 4. "If you think that I am going with you alone, you are much mistaken, Harût and Marût," I exclaimed. "Here with me is my servant without whom I do not stir," and I pointed to Hans, whom they contemplated gravely. "Also there is the Lord Ragnall, who in this land is named Igeza, and his servant, who here is named Bena, the man out of whom you drew snakes in the room in England. They also must accompany us." At this news the impassive countenances of Harût and Marût showed, I thought, some signs of disturbance. They muttered together in an unknown tongue. Then Harût said: "Our secret land is open to you alone, O Macumazana, for one purpose only, to kill the elephant Jana, for which deed we promise you a great reward. We do not wish to see the others there." "Then you can kill your own elephant, Harût and Marût, for not one step do I go with you. Why should I, when there is as much ivory here as I want to be had for the shooting?" "How if we take you, O Macumazana?" "How if I kill you both, O Harût and Marût? Fools! Here are as many brave men at my command, and if you or any with you want fighting, it shall be given you in plenty. Hans, bid the Mazitu stand to their arms and summon Igeza and Bena." "Stay, Lord," said Harût, "and put down that weapon," for once more I had produced the pistol. "We would not begin our fellowship by shedding blood, though we are safer from you than you think. Your companions shall accompany you to the land of the Kendah, but let them know that they do so at their own risk. Learn that it is revealed to us that if they go in there some of them will pass out again as spirits, but not as men." "Do you mean that you will murder them?" "No, we mean that yonder are some stronger than us or any men, who will take their lives in sacrifice. Not yours, Macumazana, for that, it is decreed, is safe, but those of 2 of the others, which 2 we do not know." "Indeed, Harût and Marût, and how am I to be sure that any of us are safe, or that you do but trick us to your country, there to kill us with treachery and steal our goods?" "Because we swear it by the oath that may not be broken. We swear it by the Heavenly Child," both of them exclaimed solemnly, speaking with one voice and bowing till their foreheads almost touched the ground. I shrugged my shoulders and laughed a little. "You do not believe us," went on Harût, "who have not heard what happens to those who break this oath. Come now and see something. Within 5 paces of your hut is a tall ant heap upon which doubtless you have been accustomed to stand and overlook the desert." This was true, but how they did guess it I wondered. "Go climb that ant heap once more." Perhaps it was rash, but my curiosity led me to accept this invitation. Out I went, followed by Hans with a loaded double-barrelled rifle, and clambered up the ant heap which, as it was 20 feet high and there were no trees just there, commanded a very fine view of the desert beyond. "Look to the north," said Harût from its foot. I looked, and there in the bright moonlight, 500 or 600 yards away, ranged rank by rank upon a slope of sand and along the crest of the ridge beyond, I saw quite 200 kneeling camels, and by each camel a tall, white-robed figure who held in his hand a long lance to the shaft of which, not far beneath the blade, was attached a little flag. For a while I stared to make sure that I was not the victim of an illusion or a mirage. Then, when I had satisfied myself that these were indeed men and camels, I descended from the ant heap. "You will admit, Macumazana," said Harût politely, "that if we had meant you any ill, with such a force it would have been easy for us to take a sleeping camp at night. But these men come here to be your escort, not to kill or enslave you or yours. Now, Macumazana, we have sworn to you the oath that may not be broken. Now we go to our people. In the morning, after you have eaten, we will return again unarmed and alone." Then, like the shadows, they slipped away. End of chapter 9. Of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Charge. 10 minutes later the truth was known and every man in the camp was up and armed. At first there were some signs of panic, but these with the help of Babemba we managed to control, setting the men to make the best preparations for defence that circumstances would allow, and thus occupying our minds. For from the first we saw that, except for the 3 of us who had horses, escape was impossible. That great camel corps could catch us within a mile. Leaving old Babemba in charge of his soldiers, we 3 white men and Hans held a council, at which I repeated every word that had passed between Harût and Marût and myself, including their absolute denial of their having had anything to do with the disappearance of Lady Ragnall on the Nile. "Now," I asked, "what is to be done? My fate is sealed, since for purposes of their own, of which probably we know nothing, these people intend to take me with them to their country, as indeed they are justified in doing, since I have been fool enough to keep a kind of assignation with them here. But they don't want anybody else. Therefore there is nothing to prevent you, Ragnall, and you, Savage, and you, Hans, from returning with the Mazitu." "Oh, Baas," said Hans, who could understand English well enough although he seldom spoke it, "why are you always bothering me with such prejudice?" that is, chatter. "Whatever you do I will do, and I don't care what you do except for your own sake, Baas. If I am going to die, let me die. It doesn't at all matter how, since I must go soon and make report to your reverend father the predicant. And now, Baas, I have been awake all night, for I heard those camels coming a long while before the 2 spookmen appeared, and as I have never heard camels before, could not make out what they were, for they don't walk like giraffes. So I am going to sleep, Baas, there in the sun. When you have settled things you can wake me up and give me your orders." And he suited the action to the word, for when I glanced at him again he was, or appeared to be, slumbering, just like a dog at its master's feet. I looked at Ragnall in interrogation. "I am going," he said briefly. "Despite the denial of these men of any complicity in your wife's fate?" I asked. "If their words are true, what have you got to gain by this journey, Ragnall?" "An interesting experience while it lasts, that is all. Like Hans there, if what they say is true, my future is a matter of complete indifference to me. But I do not believe a word of what they say. Something tells me that they know a great deal which they do not choose to repeat, about my wife I mean. That is why they are so anxious that I should not accompany you." "You must judge for yourself," I answered doubtfully, "and I hope to heaven that you are judging right. Now, Savage, what have you decided? Remember before you reply that these uncanny fellows declare that if we forego, two of us will never return. It seems impossible that they can read the future, still without doubt they are most uncanny." "Sir," said Savage, "I will take my chance. Before I left England his lordship made a provision for my old mother and my widowed sister and her children, and I have none other dependent upon me. Moreover, I won't return alone with those Mazitu to become a barbarian, for how could I find my way back to the coast without anyone to guide me? So I'll go on and leave the rest to God." "Which is just what we have all got to do," I remarked. "Well, as that is settled, let us send for Babemba and tell him." This we did accordingly. The old fellow received the news with more resignation than I had anticipated. Fixing his one eye upon me, he said: "Macumazana, these words are what I expected from you. Had any other man spoken them I should have declared that he was quite mad. But I remember that I said this when you determined to visit the Pongo and that you came back from their country safe and sound, having done wonderful things there, and that it was the Pongo who suffered, not you. So I believe it will be again, as far as you are concerned, Macumazana, for I think that some devil goes with you who looks after his own. For the others I do not know. They must settle the matter with their own devils or with those of the Kendah people. Now, farewell, Macumazana, for it comes to me that we shall meet no more. Well, that happens to all at last, and it is good to have known you who are so great in your own way. Often I shall think of you as you will think of me, and hope that in a country beyond that of the Kendah I may hear from your lips all that has befallen you on this and other journeys. Now I go to withdraw my men before these white-robed Arabs come on their strange beasts to seize you, lest they should take us also and there should be a fight in which we, being the fewer, must die. The loads are all in order, ready to be laden on their strange beasts. If they declare that the horses cannot cross the desert, leave them loose and we will catch them and take them home with us, and since they are male and female, breed young ones from them which shall be yours when you send for them, or Bausi the king's if you never send. Nay, I want no more presents who have the gun and the powder and the bullets you gave me, and the tusks of ivory for Bausi the king, and what is best of all, the memory of you and of your courage and wisdom. May these and the gods you worship befriend you. From yonder hill we will watch till we see that you have gone. Farewell." And waiting for no answer he departed with the tears running from his solitary eye. 10 minutes later the Mazitu bearers had also saluted us and gone, leaving us seated in that deserted camp surrounded by our baggage, and so far as I was concerned, feeling most lonely. Another 10 minutes went by which we occupied in packing our personal belongings. Then Hans, who was now washing out the coffee kettle at a little distance, looked up and said: "Here come the spookmen, Baas, the whole regiment of them." We ran and looked. It was true. Marshalled in orderly squadrons, the camels with their riders were sweeping towards us, and a fine sight the beasts made with their swaying necks and long lurching gait. About 50 yards away they halted just where the stream from our spring entered the desert, and there proceeded to water the camels, 20 of them at a time. Two men, however, in whom I recognized Harût and Marût, walked forward and presently were standing before us, bowing obsequiously. "Good morning, Lord," said Harût to Ragnall in his broken English. "So you come with Macumazana to call at our poor house, as we call at your fine one in England. You think we got the beautiful lady you marry, she we give old necklace. That is not so. No white lady ever in Kenderland. We hear story from Macumazana and believe that lady drowned in Nile, for you remember she woke much in her sleep. We very sorry for you, but gods know their business. They leave when they will leave, and take when they will take. You find her again some day, more beautiful still, and with her soul come back." Here I looked at him sharply. I had told him nothing about Lady Ragnall having lost her wits. How then did he know of the matter? Still I thought it best to hold my peace. I think that Harût saw he had made some mistake, for leaving the subject of Lady Ragnall he went on. "You are very welcome, O Lord, but it right to tell you this most dangerous journey, since Elephant Jana not like strangers, and," he continued slowly, "think no elephant like your blood, and all elephants brothers. What one hate, rest hate, everywhere in world. See it in your face that you already suffer great hurt from elephant, you or someone near you. Also some of Kendah very fierce people and love fighting, and perhaps there war in the land while you there, and in war people get killed." "Very good, my friend," said Ragnall. "I am prepared to take my chance of these things. Either we all go to your country together, as Macumazana has explained to you, or none of us go." "We understand. That is our bargain and we no break word," replied Harût. Then he turned his benevolent gaze upon Savage and said, "So you come too, Mr. Bena, that your name here, eh? Well, you learn lots things in Kenderland about snakes and all rest." Here the jovial-looking Marût whispered something into the ear of his companion, smiling all over his face and showing his white teeth as he did so. "Oh," went on Harût, "my brother tells me you meet one snake already, down in country called Natal, but sit on him so hard that he grow quite flat and no bite." "Who told him that?" gasped Savage. "Oh, forget. Think Macumazana. No? Then perhaps you tell him in sleep, for people talk much in sleep, you know, and some other people got good ears and hear long way. Or perhaps little joke Harût. You remember he first-rate conjurer. Perhaps he send that snake. No doubt if no how. Well, we show you much better snake in Kenderland, but you no sit on him, Mr. Bena." To me, I know not why, there was something horrible in all this jocosity, something that gave me the creeps as always does the sight of a cat playing with a mouse. I felt even then that it foreshadowed terrible things. How could these men know the details of occurrences at which they were not present and of which no one had told them? Did that strange tobacco of theirs really give them some clairvoyant power, I wondered, or had they other secret methods of obtaining news? I glanced at poor Savage and perceived that he too felt as I did, for he had turned quite pale beneath his tan. Even Hans was affected, for he whispered to me in Dutch, "These are not men, these are devils, Baas, and this journey of ours is one into hell." Only Ragnall sat stern, silent and apparently quite unmoved. Indeed, there was something almost sphinx-like about the set and expression of his handsome face. Moreover, I felt sure that Harût and Marût recognized the man's strength and determination, and that he was one with whom they must reckon seriously. Beneath all their smiles and courtesies I could read this knowledge in their eyes, also that it was causing them grave anxiety. It was as though they knew that here was one against whom their power had no avail, whose fate was the master of their fate. In a sense Harût admitted this to me, for suddenly he looked up and said in a changed voice and in Bantu, "You are a good reader of hearts, O Macumazana, almost as good as I am. But remember that there is one who writes upon the book of the heart, who is the Lord of us, who do but read, and that what he writes, that will befall, strive as we may, for in his hands is the future." "Quite so," I replied coolly, "and that is why I am going with you to Kenderland and fear you not at all." "So it is and so let it be," he answered. "And now, lords, are you ready to start? For long is the road and who knows what awaits us ere we see its end?" "Yes," I replied, "long is the road of life and who knows what awaits us ere we see its end, and after." 3 hours later I halted the splendid white riding camel upon which I was mounted and looked back from the crest of a wave of the desert. There, far behind us on the horizon, by the help of my glasses, I could make out the site of the camp we had left, and even the tall ant hill whence I had gazed in the moonlight at our mysterious escort, which seemed to have sprung from the desert as though by magic. This was the manner of our march. A mile or so ahead of us went a picket of 8 or 10 men mounted on the swiftest beasts, doubtless to give warning of any danger. Next, 300 or 400 yards away, followed a body of about 50 Kendah, travelling in a double line, and behind these the baggage men, mounted like everyone else and leading behind them strings of camels laden with water, provisions, tents of skin and all our goods, including the 50 rifles and ammunition that Ragnall had brought from England. Then came we 3 white men and Hans, each of us riding as swift and fine a camel as Africa can breed. On our right, at a distance of about half a mile, and also on our left, travelled other bodies of the Kendah of the same numerical strength as that ahead, while the rear was brought up by the remainder of the company who drove a number of spare camels. Thus we journeyed in the centre of a square whence any escape would have been impossible, for I forgot to say that our keepers, Harût and Marût, rode exactly behind us, at such a distance that we could call to them if we wished. At first I found this method of travelling very tiring, as does everyone who is quite unaccustomed to camel-back. Indeed, the swing and the jolt of the swift creature beneath me seemed to wrench my bones asunder to such an extent that at the beginning I had once or twice to be lifted from the saddle when, after hours of torture, at length we camped for the night. Poor Savage suffered even more than I did, for the motion reduced him to a kind of jelly. Ragnall, however, who I think had ridden camels before, felt little inconvenience, and the same may be said of Hans, who rode in all sorts of positions, sometimes sitting sideways like a lady, and at others kneeling on the saddle like a monkey on a barrel organ. Also, being very light and tough as rimpies, the swaying motion did not seem to affect him. By degrees all these troubles left us to such an extent that I could cover my 50 miles a day more or less without even feeling tired. Indeed, I grew to like the life in that pure and sparkling desert air, perhaps because it was so restful. Day after day we journeyed on across the endless sandy plain, watching the sun rise, watching it grow high, watching it sink again. Night after night we ate our simple food with appetite and slept beneath the glittering stars till the new dawn broke in glory from the bosom of the immeasurable East. We spoke but little during all this time. It was as though the silence of the wilderness had got hold of us and sealed our lips, or perhaps each of us was occupied with his own thoughts. At any rate, I know that for my part I seemed to live in a kind of dreamland, thinking of the past, reflecting much upon the innumerable problems of this passing show called life, but not paying much heed to the future. What did the future matter to me, who did not know whether I should have a share of it even for another month, or week, or day, surrounded as I was by the shadow of death? No, I troubled little as to any earthly future, although I admit that in this oasis of calm I reflected upon that state where past, present and future will all be one, also that those reflections, which were in their essence a kind of unshaped prayer, brought much calm to my spirit. With the regiment of escort we had practically no communication. I think that they had been forbidden to talk to us. They were a very silent set of men, finely made, capable persons of an Arab type, light rather than dark in colour, who seemed for the most part to communicate with each other by signs or in low muttered words. Evidently they looked upon Harût and Marût with great veneration, for any order which either of these brethren gave, if they were brethren, was obeyed without dispute or delay. Thus, when I happened to mention that I had lost a pocket knife at one of our camping places 2 days' journey back, 3 of them, much against my wish, were ordered to return to look for it, and did so, making no question. 8 days later they rejoined us, much exhausted and having lost a camel, but with the knife, which they handed to me with a low bow, and I confess that I felt ashamed to take the thing. Nor did we exchange many further confidences with Harût and Marût. Up to the time of our arrival at the boundaries of the Kendah country, our only talk with them was of the incidents of travel, of where we should camp, of how far it might be to the next water, for water holes or old wells existed in this desert, of such birds as we saw, and so forth. As to other and more important matters, a kind of truce seemed to prevail. Still I observed that they were always studying us, and especially Lord Ragnall, who rode on day after day, self-absorbed and staring straight in front of him as though he looked at something we could not see. Thus we covered hundreds of miles, not less than 500 at the least, reckoning our progress at only 30 miles a day including stoppages. For occasionally we stopped at the waterholes or small oases where the camels drank and rested. Indeed, these were so conveniently arranged that I came to the conclusion that once there must have been some established route running across these wastelands to the south, of which the traditional knowledge remained with the Kendah people. If so, it had not been used for generations, for save those of one or two that had died on the outward march, we saw no skeletons of camels or other beasts, or indeed any sign of man. The place was an absolute wilderness where nothing lived except a few small animals of the oases and the birds that passed over it in the air on their way to more fertile regions. Of these, by the way, I saw many that are known both to Europe and Africa, especially ducks and cranes, also storks that, for aught I can say, may have come from far off homely Holland. At last the character of the country began to change. Grass appeared on its lower lying stretches, then bushes, then occasional trees, and among the trees a few buck. Halting the caravan, I crept out and shot two of these buck with a right and left, a feat that caused our grave escort to stare in a fashion which showed me that they had never seen anything of the sort done before. That night, while we were eating the venison with relish, since it was the first fresh meat that we had tasted for many a day, I observed that the disposition of our camp was different from its common form. Thus it was smaller and placed on an eminence. Also the camels were not allowed to graze where they would as usual, but were kept within a limited area while their riders were arranged in groups outside of them. Further, the stores were piled near to our tents, in the centre, with guards set over them. I asked Harût and Marût, who were sharing our meal, the reason of these alterations. "It is because we are on the borders of the Kendah country," answered old Harût. 4 days more march will bring us there, Macumazana." "Then why should you take precautions against your own people? Surely they will welcome you." "With spears perhaps, Macumazana. Learn that the Kendah are not one but two people. As you may have heard before, we are the White Kendah, but there are also the Black Kendah who outnumber us many times over, though in the beginning we from the north conquered them, or so says our history. The White Kendah have their own territory, but as there is no other road to reach it, we must pass through that of the Black Kendah, where it is always possible that we may be attacked, especially as we bring strangers into the land." "How is it then that the Black Kendah allow you to live at all, Harût, if they are so much more numerous?" "Because of fear, Macumazana. They fear our wisdom and the decrees of the Heavenly Child, spoken through the mouth of its oracle, which, if it is offended, can bring a curse upon them. Still, if they find us outside our borders, they may kill us, if they can, as we may kill them if we find them within our borders." "Indeed, Harût. Then it looks to me as though there were a war breeding between you." "A war is breeding, Macumazana, the last great war in which either the White Kendah or the Black Kendah must perish, or perhaps both will die together. Maybe that is the real reason why we have asked you to be our guest, Macumazana." And, with their usual courteous bows, both of them rose and departed before I could reply. "You see how it stands," I said to Ragnall. "We have been brought here to fight for our friends, Harût, Marût and company, against their rebellious subjects, or rather the king who reigns jointly with them." "It looks like it," he replied quietly, "but doubtless we shall find out the truth in time, and meanwhile speculation is no good. Do you go to bed, Quatermain. I will watch till midnight and then wake you." That night passed in safety. Next day we marched before the dawn, passing through country that grew continually better watered and more fertile, though it was still open plain but sloping upwards ever more steeply. On this plain I saw herds of antelope and what in the distance looked like cattle, but no human beings. Before evening we camped where there was good water and plenty of food for the camels. While the camp was being set, Harût came and invited us to follow him to the outposts, whence he said we should see a view. We walked with him a matter of not more than a quarter of a mile to the head of that rise up which we had been travelling all day, and thence perceived one of the most glorious prospects on which my eyes have ever fallen in all great Africa. From where we stood the land sloped steeply for a matter of 10 or 15 miles, till finally the fall ended in a vast plain like to the bottom of a gigantic saucer, that I presume in some far time of the world's history was once an enormous lake. A river ran east and west across this plain and into it fell tributaries. Far beyond this river the contours of the country rose again till, many, many miles away, there appeared a solitary hill, tumulus shaped, which seemed to be covered with bush. Beyond and surrounding this hill was more plain, which with the aid of my powerful glasses was, we could see, bordered at last by a range of great mountains, looking like a blue line pencilled across a northern distance. To the east and west the plain seemed to be illimitable. Obviously its soil was of a most fertile character and supported numbers of inhabitants, for everywhere we could see their kraals or villages. Much of it to the west, however, was covered with dense forest with, to all appearance, a clearing in its midst. "Behold the land of the Kendah," said Harût. "On this side of the river Tava live the Black Kendah, on the farther side the White Kendah." "And what is that hill?" "That is the Holy Mount, the home of the Heavenly Child, where no man may set foot." Here he looked at us meaningly. "Save the priests of the Child." "What happens to him if he does?" I asked. "He dies, Lord Macumazana." "Then it is guarded, Harût?" "It is guarded, not with mortal weapons, Macumazana, but by the spirits that watch over the Child." And he would say no more on this interesting matter. I asked him as to the numbers of the Kendah people, to which he replied that the Black Kendah might number 20,000 men of arm-bearing age, but the White Kendah not more than 2,000. "Then no wonder you want spirits to guard your Heavenly Child," I remarked, "since the Black Kendah are your foes and with you warriors are few." At this moment our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a picket on a camel, who reported something to Harût which appeared to disturb him. I asked him what was the matter. "That is the matter," he said, pointing to a man mounted on a rough pony who just then appeared from behind some bushes, about half a mile away, galloping down the slope towards the plain. "He is one of the scouts of Simba, the king of the Black Kendah, and he goes to Simba's town in yonder forest to make report of our arrival. Return to camp, Macumazana, and eat, for we must march with the rising of the moon." As soon as the moon rose we marched accordingly, although the camels, many of which were much worn with the long journey, scarcely had been given time to fill themselves and none to rest. All night we marched down the long slope, only halting for half an hour before daylight to eat something and rearrange the loads on the baggage beasts, which now I noticed were guarded with extra care. When we were starting again Marût came to us and remarked with his usual smile, on behalf of his brother Harût, who was otherwise engaged, that it might be well if we had our guns ready, since we were entering into the land of the elephant Jana, and who knew but that we might meet him? "Or his worshippers on 2 legs," I suggested, to which his only reply was a nod. So we got our repeating rifles, some of the first that were ever made, serviceable but rather complicated weapons that fired 5 cartridges. Hans, however, with my permission, armed himself with the little Purdey piece that was named Intombi, the single-barrelled, muzzle-loading gun which had done me so much service in earlier days and even on my last journey to Pongoland. He said that he was accustomed to it and did not understand these new-fangled breech-loaders, also that it was lucky. I consented, as I did not think that it made much difference with what type of rifle Hans was provided. As a marksman he had this peculiarity. Up to 100 yards or so he was an excellent shot, but beyond that distance no good at all. A quarter of an hour later, as the dawn was breaking, we passed through a kind of neck of rough stones bordering on the flat land and emerged into a compact body on to the edge of the grassy plain. Here the word was given to halt for a reason that became clear to me so soon as I was out of the rocks. For there, marching rapidly, not half a mile away, were some 500 white-robed men. A large proportion of these were mounted, the best being foot soldiers, of whom more were running up every minute, appearing out of bush that grew upon the hillside, apparently to dispute our passage. These people, who were black-faced with fuzzy hair upon which they wore no headdress, all seemed to be armed with spears. Presently from out of the mass of them 2 horsemen dashed forward, one of whom bore a white flag in token that they came to parley. Our advance guard allowed them to pass and they galloped on, dodging in and out between the camels with wonderful skill, till at length they came to where we were with Harût and Marût, and pulling up their horses so sharply that the animals almost sat down on their haunches, saluted by raising their spears. They were very fine-looking fellows, perfectly black in colour with a negroid cast of countenance and long frizzled hair which hung down to their shoulders. Their clothing was light, consisting of hide riding breeches that resembled bathing drawers, sandals and an arrangement of triple chains which seemed to be made of some silvery metal that hung from their necks across the breast and back. Their arms consisted of a long lance similar to that carried by the White Kendah and a straight cross-handled sword suspended from a belt. This, as I ascertained afterwards, was the regulation cavalry equipment among these people. The footmen carried a shorter spear, a round leather shield, 2 throwing javelins or assegais, and a curved knife with a horn handle. "Greetings, Prophet of the Child," cried one of them. "We are messengers from the god Jana who speaks through the mouth of Simba the King." "Say on, worshippers of the devil Jana, what word has Simba the King for us?" answered Harût. "The word of war, Prophet. What do you beyond your southern boundary of the Tava River in the territory of the Black Kendah that was sealed to them by pact after the battle of 100 years ago? Is not all the land to the north as far as the mountains and beyond the mountains enough for you? Simba the King let you go out, hoping that the desert would swallow you, but return you shall not." "That we shall know presently," replied Harût in a suave voice. "It depends upon whether the Heavenly Child or the devil Jana is the more powerful in the land. Still, as we would avoid bloodshed if we may, we desire to explain to you, messengers of King Simba, that we are here upon a peaceful errand. It was necessary that we should convey the white lords to make an offering to the Child, and this was the only road by which we could lead them to the Holy Mount, since they come from the south. Through the forests and the swamps that lie to the east and west, camels cannot travel." "And what is the offering that the white men would make to the Child, Prophet?" "Oh, we know well, for like you we have our magic. The offering that they must make is the blood of Jana, our god, which you have brought them here to kill with their strange weapons, as though any weapon could prevail against Jana the god. Now give to us these white men that we may offer them to the god, and perchance Simba the King will let you go through." "Why?" asked Harût, "seeing that you declare that the white men cannot harm Jana, to whom indeed they wish no harm. To surrender them to you that they might be torn to pieces by the devil Jana would be to break the law of hospitality, for they are our guests. Now return to Simba the King and say to Simba that if he lifts a spear against us, the 3-fold curse of the Child shall fall upon him and upon you, his people. The curse of heaven by storm or by drought, the curse of famine, the curse of war. I, the Prophet, have spoken. Depart." Watching, I could see that this ultimatum delivered by Harût in a most impressive voice, and seconded as it was by the sudden and simultaneous lifting of the spears of all our escort that were within hearing, produced a considerable effect upon the messengers. Their faces grew afraid and they shrank a little. Evidently the threefold curse of the Child suggested calamities which they dreaded. Making no answer, they wheeled their horses about and galloped back to the force that was gathering below as swiftly as they had come. "We must fight, my lord Macumazana," said Harût, "and if we would live, conquer, as I know that we shall do." Then he issued some orders, of which the result was that the caravan adopted a wedge-shaped formation like that of a great flock of wildfowl on the wing. Harût stationed himself almost at the apex of the triangle. I, with Hans and Marût, were about the centre of the line, while Ragnall and Savage were placed opposite to us in the right line, the whole width of the wedge being between us. The baggage camels and their leaders occupied the middle space between the lines and were followed by a small rear guard. At first we white men were inclined to protest at this separation, but when Marût explained to us that its object was to give confidence to the two divisions of the force and also to minimize the risk of destruction or capture of all three of us, of course we had nothing more to say. So we just shook hands and with as much assurance as we could command, wished each other well through the job. Then we parted, poor Savage looking very limp indeed, for this was his first experience of war. Ragnall, however, who came of an old fighting stock, seemed to be happy as a king. I, who had known so many battles, was the reverse of happy, for inconveniently enough there flashed into my mind at this juncture the dying words of the Zulu captain and seer Mavovo, which foretold that I too should fall far away in war, and I wondered whether this were the occasion that had been present to his foreseeing mind. Only Hans seemed quite unconcerned. Indeed, I noted that he took the opportunity of the halt to fill and light his large corn-cob pipe, a bit of bravado in the face of Providence for which I could have kicked him had he not been perched in his usual monkey fashion on top of a very tall camel. The act, however, excited the admiration of the Kendah, for I heard one of them call to the others, "Look, he is not a monkey after all but a man, more of a man than his master." The arrangements were soon made. Within a quarter of an hour of the departure of the messengers, Harût, after bowing thrice towards the holy mountain, rose in his stirrups and shaking a long spear above his head, shouted a single word: "Charge!" End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Allan is captured. The ride that followed was really quite exhilarating. The camels, notwithstanding their long journey, seemed to have caught some of the enthusiasm of the war horse as they described in the book of Job. Indeed, I had no idea that they could travel at such a rate. On we swung down the slope, keeping excellent order, the forest of tall spears shining and the little lancer-like pennons flying on the breeze in a very gallant way. In silence we went, save for the thudding of the hoofs of the camel and an occasional squeal of anger as some rider drove his lance handle into their ribs. Not until we actually joined battle did a single man open his lips. Then, it is true, there went up one simultaneous and mighty roar of "The Child! Death to Jana! The Child! The Child!" But this happened a few minutes later. As we drew near the enemy I saw that they had massed their footmen in a dense body, 6 or 8 lines thick. There they stood to receive the impact of our charge, or rather they did not all stand, for the first 2 ranks were kneeling with long spears stretched out in front of them. I imagine that their appearance must have greatly resembled that of a Greek phalanx, or that of the Swiss prepared to receive cavalry in the Middle Ages. On either side of this formidable body, which by now must have numbered 400 or 500 men, and at a distance perhaps of a quarter mile from them, were gathered the horsemen of the Black Kendah, divided into 2 bodies of nearly equal strength, say about 100 horse in each body. As we approached, our triangle curved a little, no doubt under the direction of Harût. A minute or so later I saw the reason. It was that we might strike the foot soldiers not full in front but at an angle. It was an admirable manoeuvre, for when presently we did strike, we caught them swiftly on the flank and crumpled them up. My word, we went through those fellows like a knife through butter. They had as much chance against the rush of our camels as a brown paper screen has against a typhoon. Over they rolled in heaps while the White Kendah spitted them with their lances. "The Child is top dog. My money on the Child," reflected I in a reverent ecstasy. But that exultation was premature, for those Black Kendah were by no means all dead. Presently I saw that scores of them had appeared among the camels, which they were engaged in stabbing or trying to stab in the stomach with their spears. Also I had forgotten the horsemen. As our charge slackened owing to the complication in front, these arrived on our flanks like two thunderbolts. We faced about and did our best to meet the onslaught, of which the net result was that both our left and right lines were pierced through about 50 yards behind the baggage camels. Luckily for us, the very impetuosity of the Black Kendah rush deprived it of most of the fruits of victory, since the two squadrons, being unable to check their horses, ended by charging into each other and becoming mixed in inextricable confusion. Then, I do not know who gave the order, we wheeled our camels in and fell upon them, a struggling stationary mass, with the result that many of them were speared or overthrown and trampled. I have said we, but that is not quite correct, at any rate so far as Marût, Hans, I and about 15 camel men were concerned. How it happened I could not tell in that dust and confusion, but we were cut off from the main body and presently found ourselves fighting desperately in a group at which Black Kendah horsemen were charging again and again. We made the best stand we could. By degrees the bewildered camels sank under the repeated spear thrusts of the enemy, all except one. Oddly enough that ridden by Hans, which by some strange chance was never touched. The rest of us were thrown or tumbled off the camels and continued the fight from behind their struggling bodies. That is where I came in. Up to this time I had not fired a single shot, partly because I do not like missing, which is so easy to do from the back of a swaying camel, and still more for the reason that I had not the slightest desire to kill any of these savage men unless I was obliged to do so in self-defence. Now, however, the thing was different, as I was fighting for my life. Leaning against my camel, which was dying and beating its head upon the ground, groaning horribly the while, I emptied the 5 cartridges of the repeater into those Black Kendah, pausing between each shot to take aim, with the result that presently 5 riderless horses were galloping loose about the veldt. The effect was electrical, since our attackers had never seen anything of the kind before. For a while they all drew off, which gave me time to reload. Then they came on again and I repeated the process. For a second time they retreated and after consultation which lasted for a minute or more made a third attack. Once more I saluted them to the best of my ability, though on this occasion only 3 men and a horse fell. The 5th shot was a clean miss because they came on in such a scattered formation that I had to turn from side to side to fire. Now at last the game was up, for the simple reason that I had no more cartridges save 2 in my double-barrelled pistol. It may be asked why. The answer is want of a foresight. Too many cartridges in one's pocket are apt to chafe on camelback, and so is a belt full of them. In those days also the engagements were few in which a man fired over 15. I had 40 or 50 more in a bag, which bag Savage with his usual politeness had taken and hung about his saddle without saying a word to me. At the beginning of the action I found this out, but could not get them from him as he was separated from me. Hans, always careless in small matters, was really to blame, as he ought to have seen that I had the cartridges, or at any rate to have carried them himself. In short, it was one of those accidents that will happen. There is nothing more to be said. After a still longer consultation our enemies advanced on us for the 4th time, but very slowly. Meanwhile I had been taking stock of the position. The Camel Corps, or what was left of it, oblivious of our plight which the dust of conflict had hidden from them, was travelling on to the north, more or less victorious. That is to say, it had cut its way through the Black Kendah and was escaping unpursued, huddled up in a mob with the baggage animals safe in its centre. The Black Kendah themselves were engaged in killing our wounded and succouring their own, also in collecting the bodies of the dead. In short, quite unintentionally, we were deserted. Probably if anybody thought about us at all in the turmoil of desperate battle, they concluded that we were among the slain. Marût came up to me unhurt, still smiling and waving a bloody spear. "Lord Macumazana," he said, "the end is at hand. The Child has saved the others or most of them, but us it has abandoned. Now what will you do? Kill yourself, or if that does not please you, suffer me to kill you, or shoot on until you must surrender?" "I have nothing to shoot with any more," I answered, "but if we surrender, what will happen to us?" "We shall be taken to Simba's town and there sacrificed to the devil Jana. I have not time to tell you how, therefore I propose to kill myself." "Then I think you are foolish, Marût, since once we are dead, we are dead. But while we are alive it is always possible that we may escape from Jana. If the worst comes to the worst, I have a pistol with 2 bullets in it, one for you and one for me." "The wisdom of the Child is in you," he replied. "I shall surrender with you, Macumazana, and take my chance." Then he turned and explained things to his followers, who spoke together for a moment. In the end these took a strange and, to my mind, a very heroic decision. Waiting till the attacking Kendah were quite close to us, with the exception of 3 men, who either because they lacked courage or for some other reason stayed with us, they advanced humbly as though to make submission. A number of the Black Kendah dismounted and ran up, I suppose, to take them prisoners. The men waited till these were all round them. Then with a yell of "The Child!" they sprang forward, taking the enemy unawares and fighting like demons, inflicted great loss upon them before they fell themselves covered with wounds. "Brave men indeed," said Marût approvingly. "Well, now they are all at peace with the Child, where doubtless we shall find them ere long." I nodded but answered nothing. To tell the truth, I was too much engaged in nursing the remains of my own courage to enter into conversation about that of other people. This fierce and cunning stratagem of desperate men which had cost their enemies so dear seemed to infuriate the Black Kendah. At us came the whole mob of them. We were but 6 now, roaring "Jana! Jana!" and led by a greybeard who, to judge from the number of silver chains upon his breast and his other trappings, seemed to be a great man among them. When they were about 50 yards away and I was preparing for the worst, a shot rang out from above and behind me. At the same instant Greybeard threw his arms wide and letting fall the spear he held, pitched from his horse, evidently stone dead. I glanced back and saw Hans, the corncob pipe still in his mouth and the little rifle Intombi still at his shoulder. He had fired from the back of the camel, I think for the first time that day, and whether by chance or through good marksmanship I do not know, had killed this man. His sudden and unexpected end seemed to fill the Black Kendah with grief and dismay. Halting in their charge, they gathered round him, while a fierce-looking middle-aged man, also adorned with much barbaric finery, dismounted to examine him. "That is Simba the King," said Marût, "and the slain one is his uncle, Goru, the great general who brought him up from a babe." "Then I wish I had another cartridge left for the nephew," I began, and stopped, for Hans was speaking to me. "Goodbye, Baas," he said. "I must go, for I cannot load Intombi on the back of this beast. If you meet your reverend father the Predikant before I do, tell him to make a nice place ready for me among the fires." Then before I could get out an answer, Hans dragged his camel round. As I have said, it was quite uninjured. Urging it to a shambling gallop with the blows of the rifle stock, he departed at a great rate, not towards the home of the Child, but up the hill into a brake of giant grass mingled with thorn trees that grew quite close at hand. Here with startling suddenness both he and the camel vanished away. If the Black Kendah saw him go, of which I am doubtful, for they all seemed to be lost in consultation round their king and the dead general Goru, they made no attempt to follow him. Another possibility is that they thought he was trying to lead them into some snare or ambush. I do not know what they thought because I never heard them mention Hans or the matter of his disappearance. if indeed they ever realized that there was such a person. Curiously enough, in the case of men who had just shown themselves so brave, this last accident of the decease of Goru coming on top of all their other casualties seemed to take the courage out of them. It was as though they had come to the conclusion that we with our guns were something more than mortal. For several minutes they debated in evident hesitation. At last from out of their array rode a single man, in whom I recognized one of the envoys who had met us in the morning, carrying in his hand a white flag as he had done before. Thereon I laid down my rifle in token that I would not fire at him, which indeed I could not do, having nothing to fire. Seeing this, he came to within a few yards and, halting, addressed Marût. "O second prophet of the Child," he said, "these are the words of Simba the King. Your God has been too strong for us today, though in a day to come it may be otherwise. I thought I had you in a pit, that you were the bucks and I the hunter. But though with loss you have escaped out of the pit," and the speaker glanced towards our retreating force, which was now but a cloud of dust in the far distance, "while I the hunter have been gored by your horns," and again he glanced at the dead that were scattered about the plain. "The noblest of the buck, the white bull of the herd," and he looked at me, who in any other circumstances would have felt complimented, "and you, O Prophet Marût, and one or two others, besides those that I have slain, are however still in the pit and your horn is a magic horn," here he pointed to my rifle, "which pierces from afar and kills dead all by whom it is touched." So I caught those gentry well in the middle, thought I to myself, and with soft-nosed bullets. "Therefore I, Simba the King, make you an offer. Yield yourselves and I swear that no spear shall be driven through your hearts and no knife come near your throats. You shall only be taken to my town and there be fed on the best and kept as prisoners, till once more there is peace between the Black Kendah and the White. If you refuse, then I will ring you round and perhaps in the dark rush on you and kill you all. Or perhaps I will watch you from day to day till you, who have no water, die of thirst in the heat of the sun. These are my words to which nothing may be added and from which nothing shall be taken away." Having finished this speech he rode back a few yards out of earshot and waited. "What will your answer, Lord Macumazana?" asked Marût. I replied by another question. "Is there any chance of our being rescued by your people?" He shook his head. "None. What we have seen today is but a small part of the army of the Black Kendah, one regiment of foot and one of horse, that are always ready. By tomorrow thousands will be gathered, many more than we can hope to deal with in the open and still less in their strongholds. Also Harût will believe that we are dead. Unless the Child saves us, we shall be left to our fate." "Then it seems we are indeed in a pit, as that black brute of a king puts it, Marût. And if he does what he says and rushes at us at sundown, every one of us will be killed. Also I am thirsty already and there is nothing to drink. But will this king keep his word? There are other ways of dying besides by steel." "I think that he will keep his word, but as that messenger said, he will not add to his word. Choose now, for see, they are beginning to hedge us round." "What say you, men?" I asked of the three who had remained with us. "We say, Lord, that we are in the hands of the Child, though we wish now that we had died with our brothers," answered their spokesman fatalistically. So after Marût and I had consulted together for a little as to the form of his reply, he beckoned to the messenger and said: "We accept the offer of Simba, although it would be easy for this lord to kill him now where he stands, namely to yield ourselves as prisoners on his oath that no harm shall come to us. For know that if harm does come, the vengeance will be terrible. Now in proof of his good faith, let Simba draw near and drink the cup of peace with us, for we thirst." "Not so," said the messenger. "From then that white lord might kill him with his tube. Give me the tube and Simba shall come." "Take it," I said magnanimously, handing him the rifle, which he received in a very gingerly fashion. After all, I reflected, there is nothing much more useless than a rifle without ammunition. Off he went holding the weapon at arm's length, and presently Simba himself, accompanied by some of his men, one of whom carried a skin of water and another a large cup hollowed from an elephant's tusk, rode up to us. This Simba was a fine and rather terrifying person with a large moustache and a chin shaved except for a little tuft of hair which he wore at its point like an Italian. His eyes were big and dark, frank looking, yet now and again with sinister expression in the corners of them. He was not nearly so black as most of his followers. Probably in bygone generations his blood had been crossed with that of the White Kendah. He wore his hair long without any headdress, held in place by a band of gold which I suppose represented a crown. On his forehead was a large white scar, probably received in some battle. Such was his appearance. He looked at me with great curiosity, and I have often wondered since what kind of an impression I produced upon him. My hat had fallen off, or I had knocked it off when I fired my last cartridge into his people and forgotten to replace it, and my intractable hair, which was longer than usual, had not been recently brushed. My worn Norfolk jacket was dyed with blood from a wounded or dying man who had tumbled against me in the scrimmage when the cavalry charged us, and my right leg and boot were stained in a similar fashion from having rubbed against my camel where a spear had entered it. Altogether I must have appeared a most disreputable object. Some indication of his opinion was given, however, in a remark which of course I pretended not to understand, that I overheard him make to one of his officers. "Truly," he said, "we must not always look to the strong for strength, and yet this little white porcupine is strength itself, for see how much damage he has wrought us. Also consider his eyes that appear to pierce everything. Jana himself might fear those eyes. Well, time that grinds the rocks will tell us all." All of this I caught perfectly, my ears being very sharp, although he thought that he spoke out of my hearing, for after spending a month in their company I understood the Kendah dialect of Bantu very well. Having delivered himself thus, he rode nearer and said: "You, Prophet Marût, my enemy, have heard the terms of me, Simba the King, and have accepted them. Therefore discuss them no more. What I have promised I will keep. What I have given I give, neither greater nor less by the weight of a hair." "So be it, O King," answered Marût with his usual smile, which nothing ever seemed to disturb. "Only remember that, if those terms are broken either in the letter or in the spirit, especially the spirit, that is the best rendering I can give you of his word, the manifold curses of the Child will fall upon you and yours. Yes, though you kill us all by treachery, still those curses will fall." "May Jana take the Child and all who worship it!" exclaimed the king with evident irritation. "In the end, O King, Jana will take the Child and its followers, or the Child will take Jana and his followers. Which of these things must happen is known to the Child alone and perchance to its prophets. Meanwhile, for every one of those of the Child I think that 3 of the followers of Jana or more lie dead upon this field. Also the caravan is now out of your reach with 2 of the white lords and many of such tubes which deal death, like that which we have surrendered to you. Therefore, because we are helpless, do not think that the Child is helpless. Jana must have been asleep, O King, or you would have set your trap better." I thought that this coolly insolent speech would have produced some outburst, but in fact it seemed to have the opposite effect. Making no reply to it, Simba said almost humbly: "I come to drink the cup of peace with you and the White Lord, O Prophet. Afterwards we can talk. Give me water, slave." Then a man filled the great ivory cup with water from the skin he carried. Simba took it and having sprinkled a little upon the ground, I suppose as an offering, drank from the cup, doubtless to show that it was not poisoned. Watching carefully, I made sure that he swallowed what he drank by studying the motions of his throat. Then he handed the cup with a bow to Marût, who with a still deeper bow passed it to me. Being absolutely parched, I absorbed about a pint of it, and feeling a new man, passed the horn to Marût, who swallowed the rest. Then it was filled again for our three white Kendah, the king first tasting the water as before, after which Marût and I had a second pull. When at length our thirst was satisfied, horses were brought to us, serviceable and docile little beasts, with sheepskins for saddles and loops of hide for stirrups. On these we mounted and for the next 3 hours rode across the plain, surrounded by a strong escort and with an armed Black Kendah running on each side of our horses, and holding in his hand a thong attached to the ring of the bridle, no doubt to prevent any attempt to escape. Our road ran past but not through some villages, whence we saw many women and children staring at us, and through beautiful crops of mealies and other sorts of grain that in this country were now just ripening. The luxuriant appearance of these crops suggested that the rains must have been plentiful and the season all that could be desired. From some of the villages by the track arose a miserable sound of wailing. Evidently their inhabitants had already heard that certain of their menkind had fallen in that morning's fight. At the end of the 3rd hour we began to enter the great forest which I had seen when first we looked down on Kenderland. It was filled with splendid trees, most of them quite strange to me, but perhaps because of the denseness of their overshadowing crowns there was comparatively no undergrowth. The general effect of the place was very gloomy, since little light could pass through the interlacing foliage of the tops of those mighty trees. Towards evening we came to a clearing in this forest. It may have been 4 or 5 miles in diameter, but whether it was natural or artificial I am not sure. I think, however, that it was probably the former for 2 reasons: the hollow nature of the ground, which lay a good many feet lower than the surrounding forest, and the wonderful fertility of the soil, which suggested that it had once been deposited upon an old lake bottom. Never did I see such crops as those that grew upon that clearing. They were magnificent. Wending our way along the road that ran all through the tall corn, for here every inch was cultivated, we came suddenly upon the capital of the Black Kendah, which was known as Simba Town. It was a large place, somewhat different from any other African settlement with which I am acquainted, inasmuch as it was not only stockaded but completely surrounded by a broad artificial moat filled with water from a stream that ran through the centre of the town, over which moat there were 4 timber bridges placed at the cardinal points of the compass. These bridges were strong enough to bear horses or stock, but so made that in the event of attack they could be destroyed in a few minutes. Riding through the eastern gate, a stout timber structure on the farther side of the corresponding bridge, where the king was received with salutes by an armed guard, we entered one of the main streets of the town, which ran from north to south and from east to west. It was broad and on either side of it were the dwellings of the inhabitants set close together because the space within the stockade was limited. These were not huts but square buildings of mud with flat roofs of some kind of cement. Evidently they were built upon the model of Oriental and North African houses, of which some debased tradition remained with these people. Thus a stairway or ladder ran from the interior to the roof of each house, whereon its inhabitants were accustomed, as I discovered afterwards, to sleep during a good part of the year, also to eat in the cool of the day. Many of them were gathered there now to watch us pass, men, women and children, all except the little ones decently clothed in long garments of various colours, the women for the most part in white, and the men in a kind of bluish linen. I saw at once that they had already heard of the fight and of the considerable losses which their people had sustained, for their reception of us prisoners was most unfriendly. Indeed, the men shook their fists at us, the women screamed out curses, while the children stuck out their tongues in token of derision or defiance. Most of these demonstrations, however, were directed at Marût and his followers, who only smiled indifferently. At me they stared in wonder, not unmixed with fear. A quarter of a mile or so from the gate we came to an inner enclosure that answered to the South African cattle kraal, surrounded by a dry ditch and a timber palisade outside of which was planted a green fence of some shrub with long white thorns. Here we passed through more gates, to find ourselves in an oval space perhaps 5 acres in extent. Evidently this served as a market ground, but all around it were open sheds where hundreds of horses were stabled. No cattle seemed to be kept there, except a few that with sheep and goats were driven in every day for slaughter purposes at a shambles at the north end, from the great stock kraals built beyond the forest to the south, where they were safe from possible raiding by the White Kendah. A tall reed fence cut off the southern end of this marketplace, outside of which we were ordered to dismount. Passing through yet another gate, we found within the fence a large hut or house built on the same model as the others in the town, which Marût whispered to me was that of the king. Behind it were smaller houses in which lived his queen and women, good-looking females, who advanced to meet him with obsequious bows. To the right and left were two more buildings of about equal size, one of which was occupied by the royal guard, and the other was the guest house, whither we were conducted. It proved to be a comfortable dwelling, about 30 feet square but containing only one room, with various huts behind it that served for cooking and other purposes. In one of these the 3 camel-men were placed. Immediately on our arrival food was brought to us, a lamb or kid roasted whole upon a wooden platter, and some green mealie cobs boiled upon another platter, also water to drink and wash with in earthenware jars of sun-dried clay. I ate heartily, for I was starving. Then, as it was useless to attempt precautions against murder, without any talk to my fellow prisoner, for which we were both too tired, I threw myself down on a mattress stuffed with corn husks in a corner of the hut, drew a skin rug over me and, having commended myself to the protection of the Power above, fell fast asleep. End of chapter 11. Of the Ivory Child by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The First Curse. The next thing I remember was feeling upon my face the sunlight that poured through a window place which was protected by immovable wooden bars. For a while I lay still, reflecting as memory returned to me upon all the events of the previous day and upon my present unhappy position. Here was I, a prisoner in the hands of a horde of fierce savages who had every reason to hate me, for though this was done in self-defence, had I not killed a number of their people against whom personally I had no quarrel? It was true that their king had promised me safety, but what reliance could be put upon the word of such a man? Unless something occurred to save me, without doubt my days were numbered. In this way or in that I should be murdered, which served me right for ever entering upon such a business. The only satisfactory point in the story was that, for the present at any rate, Ragnall and Savage had escaped, though doubtless sooner or later fate would overtake them also. I was sure that they had escaped, since 2 of the camel-men with us had informed Marût that they saw them swept away surrounded by our people and quite unharmed. Now they would be grieving over my death, since none survived who could tell them of our capture, unless the Black Kendah chose to do so, which was not likely. I wondered what course they would take when Ragnall found that his quest was in vain, as of course must happen. Try to get out of the country, I suppose, as I prayed they might succeed in doing, though this was most improbable. Then there was Hans. He, of course, would attempt to retrace our road across the desert, if he had got clear away. Having a good camel, a rifle and some ammunition, it was just possible that he might win through, as he never forgot a path which he had once travelled, though probably in a week's time a few bones upon the desert would be all that remained of him. Well, as he had suggested, perhaps we should soon be talking the event over in some far sphere with my father and others. Poor old Hans! I opened my eyes and looked about me. The first thing I noticed was that my double-barrelled pistol, which I had placed at full cock beside me before I went to sleep, was gone, also my large clasp knife. This discovery did not tend to raise my spirits, since I was now quite weaponless. Then I observed Marût seated on the floor of the hut staring straight in front of him, and noted that at length even he had ceased to smile, but that his lips were moving as though he were engaged in prayer or meditation. "Marût," I said, "someone has been in this place while we were asleep and stolen my pistol and knife." "Yes, Lord," he answered, "and my knife also. I saw them come in the middle of the night, two men who walked softly as cats and searched everything." "Then why did you not wake me?" "What would have been the use, Lord? If we had caught hold of the men, they would have called out and we should have been murdered at once. It was best to let them take the things, which, after all, are of no good to us here." "The pistol might have been of some good," I replied significantly. "Yes," he said, nodding, "but at the worst death is easy to find. Do you think, Marût, that we could manage to let Harût and the others know of our plight? That smoke which I breathed in England, for instance, seemed to show me far off things. If we could get any of it—" "The smoke was nothing, Lord, but some harmless burning powder which clouded your mind for a minute and enabled you to see the thoughts that were in our minds. We drew the pictures at which you looked. Also here there is none." "Oh," I said, "the old trick of suggestion, just what I imagined. Then there's an end of that, and as the others will think that we are dead and we cannot communicate with them, we have no hope except in ourselves." "Or the Child," suggested Marût gently. "Look here," I said with irritation, "after you have just told me that your smoke vision was a mere conjurer's trick, how do you expect me to believe in your blessed Child? Who is the Child? What is the Child? And, this is more important, what can it do? As your throat is going to be cut shortly, you may as well tell me the truth." "Lord Macumazana, I will. Who and what the Child is I cannot say because I do not know, but it has been our god for thousands of years, and we believe that our remote forefathers brought it with them when they were driven out of Egypt at some time unknown. We have writings concerning it done up in little rolls, but as we cannot read them they are of no use to us. It is an hereditary priesthood of which Harût, my uncle, for he is my uncle, is the head. We believe that the Child is God, or rather a symbol in which God dwells, and that it can save us in this world and the next, for we hold that man is an immortal spirit. We believe also that through its oracle, a priestess who is called Guardian of the Child, it can declare the future and bring blessings or curses upon men, especially upon our enemies. When the oracle dies we are helpless, since the Child has no mouth and our enemies prevail against us. This happened a long while ago, and the last oracle having declared before her death that her successor was to be found in England, my uncle and I travelled thither disguised as conjurers and made search for many years. We thought that we had found the new oracle in the lady who married the Lord Igeza because of that mark of the new moon upon her neck. After our return to Africa, however, for as I have spoken of this matter I may as well tell you all," here he stared me full in the eyes and spoke in a clear metallic voice which somehow no longer convinced me, "we found that we had made a mistake, for the real oracle, a mere girl, was discovered among our own people and has now been for 2 years installed in her office. Without doubt the last guardian of the Child was wandering in her mind when she told us that story before her death as to a woman in England, a country of which she had heard through Arabs. That is all." "Thank you," I replied, feeling that it would be useless to show any suspicion of his story. "Now will you be so good as to tell me who and what is the god, or the elephant Jana, whom you have brought me here to kill? Is the elephant a god or is the god an elephant? In either case, what has it to do with the Child?" "Lord, Jana among us Kendah represents the evil in the world, as the Child represents the good. Jana is he whom the Mohammedans call Shaitan and the Christians call Satan, and our forefathers, the old Egyptians, called Set." "Ah," thought I to myself, "now we have got it. Horus the divine Child and Set the evil monster, with whom it strives everlastingly." "Always," went on Marût, "there has been war between the Child and Jana, that is, between good and evil, and we know that in the end one of them must conquer the other." "The whole world has known that from the beginning," I interrupted, "but who and what is this Jana?" "Among the Black Kendah, Lord, Jana is an elephant, or at any rate his symbol is an elephant, a very terrible beast to which sacrifices are made, that kills all who do not worship him if he chances to meet them. He lives farther on in the forest yonder, and the Black Kendah make use of him in war, for the devil in him obeys their priests." "Indeed. And is this elephant always the same?" "I cannot tell you, but for many generations it has been the same, for it is known by its size and by the fact that one of its tusks is twisted downwards." "Well," I remarked, "all this proves nothing, since elephants certainly live for at least 200 years and perhaps much longer. Also, after they become rogues, they acquire every kind of wicked and unnatural habit, as to which I could tell you lots of stories. Have you seen this elephant?" "No, Macumazana," he answered with a shiver. "If I had seen it, should I have been alive today? Yet I fear I am fated to see it ere long. Not alone." Again he shivered, looking at me in a very suggestive manner. At this moment our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of two Black Kendahs who brought us our breakfast of porridge and a boiled fowl, and stood there while we ate it. For my part I was not sorry, as I had learned all I wanted to know of the theological opinions and practices of the land, and had come to the conclusion that the terrible devil god of the Black Kendah was merely a rogue elephant of unusual size and ferocity, which under other circumstances it would have given me the greatest pleasure to try to shoot. When we had finished eating, that is soon, for neither of our appetites was good that morning, we walked out of the house into the surrounding compound and visited the camel-men in their hut. Here we found them squatted on the ground, looking very depressed indeed. When I asked them what was the matter, they replied nothing, except that they were men about to die and life was pleasant. Also they had wives and children whom they would never see again. Having tried to cheer them up to the best of my ability, which I fear I did without conviction, for in my heart I agreed with their view of the case, we returned to the guest house and mounted the stair which led to the flat roof. Hence we saw that some curious ceremony was in progress in the centre of the marketplace. At that distance we could not make out the details, for I forgot to say that my glasses had been stolen with the pistol and knife, probably because they were supposed to be lethal weapons or instruments of magic. A rough altar had been erected on which a fire burned. Behind it the king, Simba, was seated on a stool with various councillors about him. In front of the altar was a stout wooden table, on which lay what looked like the body of a goat or a sheep. A fantastically dressed man, assisted by other men, appeared to be engaged in inspecting the inside of this animal with, we gathered, unsatisfactory results, for presently he raised his arms and uttered a loud wail. Then the creature's viscera were removed from it and thrown upon the fire, while the rest of the carcass was carried off. I asked Marût what he thought they were doing. He replied dejectedly, "Consulting their oracle, perhaps as to whether we should live or die, Macumazana." Just then the priest in the strange feathered attire approached the king, carrying some small object in his hand. I wondered what it could be, till the sound of a report reached my ears and I saw the man began to jump around upon one leg, holding the other with both his hands at the knee and howling loudly. "Ah," I said, "that pistol was full cocked, and the bullet got him in the foot." Simba shouted out something, whereon a man picked up the pistol and threw it into the fire, round which the others gathered to watch it burn. "You wait," I said to Marût, and as I spoke the words the inevitable happened. Off went the other barrel of the pistol, which hopped out of the fire with the recoil like a living thing. But as it happened one of the assistant priests was standing in front of the mouth of that barrel, and he also hopped once, but never again, for the heavy bullet struck him somewhere in the body and killed him. Now there was consternation. Everyone ran away, leaving the dead man lying on the ground. Simba led the rout and the head priest brought up the rear, skipping along upon one leg. Having observed these events, which filled me with an unholy joy, we descended into the house again as there was nothing more to see. Also because it occurred to me that our presence on the roof, watching their discomfiture, might irritate these savages. About 10 minutes later the gate of the fence round the guest house was thrown open, and through it came 4 men carrying on a stretcher the body of the priest whom the bullet had killed, which they laid down in front of our door. Then followed the king with an armed guard, and after him the befeathered diviner with his foot bound up, who supported himself upon the shoulders of two of his colleagues. This man, I now perceived, wore a hideous mask from which projected two tusks in imitation of those of an elephant. Also there were others, as many as the space would hold. The king called to us to come out of the house, which, having no choice, we did. One glance at him showed me that the man was frantic with fear or rage, or both. "Look upon your work, magicians," he said in a terrible voice, pointing first to the dead priest, then to the diviner's wounded foot. "It is no work of ours, King Simba," answered Marût. "It is your own work. You stole the magic weapon of the White Lord and made it angry, so that it has revenged itself upon you." "It is true," said Simba, "that the tube has killed one of those who took it away from you and wounded the other." Here was luck indeed. "But it was you who ordered it to do so, magicians. Now, hark! Yesterday I promised you safety, but no spear should pierce your hearts and no knife come near your throats, and drank the cup of peace with you. But you have broken the pact, working us more harm, and therefore it no longer holds, since there are many other ways in which men can die. Listen again. This is my decree. By your magic you have taken away the life of one of my servants and hurt another of my servants, destroying the middle toe of his left foot. If within 3 days you do not give back the life to him who seems to be dead, and give back the toe to him who seems to be hurt, as you well can do, then you shall join those whom you have slain in the land of death. How, I will not tell you." Now when I heard this amazing sentence I gasped within myself, but thinking it better to keep up my role of understanding nothing of their talk, I preserved an immovable countenance and left Marût to answer. This, to his credit be it recorded, he did with his customary pleasant smile. "O King," he said, "who can bring back the dead to life? Not even the Child itself, at any rate in this world, for there is no way." "Then, Prophet of the Child, you had better find a way, or I repeat, I send you to join them," he shouted, rolling his eyes. "What did my brother, the great Prophet, promise to you but yesterday, O King, if you harmed us?" asked Marût. "Was it not that the 3 great curses should fall upon your people? Learn now that if so much as one of us is murdered by you, these things shall swiftly come to pass. I, Marût, who am also a prophet of the Child, have said it." Now Simba seemed to go quite mad, so mad that I thought it was all over. He waved his spear and danced about in front of us till the silver chains clanked upon his breast. He vituperated the Child and its worshippers, who, he declared, had worked evil on the Black Kendah for generations. He appealed to his god Jana to avenge these evils, to pierce the Child with his tusks, to tear it with his trunk and to trample it with his feet, all of which the wounded diviner ably seconded through his horrid mask. There we stood before him, I leaning against the wall of the house with an air of studied nonchalance mingled with mild interest, at least that is what I meant to do, and Marût smiling sweetly and staring at the heavens. Whilst I was wondering what exact portion of my frame was destined to become acquainted with that spear, of a sudden Simba gave it up. Turning to his followers, he bade them dig a hole in the corner of our little enclosure and set the dead man in it, with his head out so that he may breathe, an order which they promptly executed. Then he issued a command that we should be well fed and tended, and remarking that if the departed was not alive and healthy on the 3rd morning from that day we should hear from him again, he and his company stalked off, except those men who were occupied with the interment. Soon this was finished also. There sat the deceased, buried to the neck with his face looking towards the house, a most disagreeable sight. Presently, however, matters were improved in this respect by one of the sextons fetching a large earthenware pot and several smaller pots full of food and water. The latter they set round the head, I suppose for the sustenance of the body beneath, and then placed the big vessel inverted over all, to keep the sun off our sleeping brother, as I heard one say to the other. This pot looked innocent enough when all was done, like one of those that gardeners in England put over forced rhubarb, no more. And yet, such is the strength of the imagination, I think that on the whole I should have preferred the object underneath naked and unadorned. For instance, I have forgotten to say that the heads of those of the White Kendah who had fallen in the fight had been set up on poles in front of Simba's house. They were unpleasant to contemplate, but to my mind not so unpleasant as that pot. As a matter of fact, this precaution against injury from the sun to the late diviner proved unnecessary, since by some strange chance from that moment the sun ceased to shine. Quite suddenly clouds arose which gradually covered the whole sky, and the weather began to turn very cold, unprecedentedly so, Marût informed me, for the time of year, which it will be remembered in this country was the season just before harvest. Obviously the Black Kendah thought so also, since from our seats on the roof, whither we had retreated to be as far as possible from the pot, we saw them gathered in the market-place, staring at the sky and talking to each other. The day passed without any further event, except the arrival of our meals, for which we had no great appetite. The night came, earlier than usual because of the clouds, and we fell asleep, or rather into a series of dozes. Once I thought that I heard someone stirring in the huts behind us, but as it was followed by silence I took no more notice. At length the light broke very slowly, for now the clouds were denser than ever. Shivering with the cold, Marût and I made a visit to the camel drivers, who were not allowed to enter our house. On going into their hut we saw to our horror that only two of them remained, seated stonily upon the floor. We asked where the third was. They replied they did not know. In the middle of the night, they said, men had crept in, who seized, bound and gagged him, then dragged him away. There was nothing to be said or done. We returned to breakfast filled with horrid fears. Nothing happened that day except that some priests arrived, lifted the earthen pot, examined their departed colleague, who by now had become an unencouraging spectacle, removed old dishes of food, arranged more about him, and went off. Also the clouds grew thicker and thicker, and the air more and more chilly, till, had we been in any northern latitude, I should have said that snow was pending. From our perch on the rooftop I observed the population of Simba Town discussing the weather with ever-increasing eagerness, also that the people who were going out to work in the fields wore mats upon their shoulders. Once more darkness came, and this night, notwithstanding the cold, we spent wrapped in rugs on the roof of the house. It had occurred to us that kidnapping would be less easy there, as we could make some sort of a fight at the head of the stairway, or, if the worst came to the worst, dive from the parapet and break our necks. We kept watch turn and turn about. During my watch about midnight I heard a noise going on in the hut behind us, scuffling and a stifled cry which turned my blood cold. About an hour later a fire was lighted in the centre of the market-place where the sheep had been sacrificed, and by the flare of it I could see people moving. But what they did I could not see, which was, perhaps, as well. Next morning only one of the camel men was left. This remaining man was now almost crazy with fear, and could give no clear account of what had happened to his companion. The poor fellow implored us to take him away to our house, as he feared to be left alone with the black devils. We tried to do so, but armed guards appeared mysteriously and thrust him back into his own hut. This day was an exact repetition of the others, the same inspection of the deceased and renewal of his food, the same cold, clouded sky, the same agitated conferences in the market-place. For the third time darkness fell upon us in that horrible place. Once more we took refuge on the roof, but this night neither of us slept. We were too cold, too physically miserable, and too filled with mental apprehensions. All nature seemed to be big with impending disaster. The sky appeared to be sinking down upon the earth. The moon was hidden, yet a faint and lurid light shone now in one quarter of the horizon, now in another. There was no wind, but the air moaned audibly. It was as though the end of the world were near, as, I reflected, probably might be the case so far as we were concerned. Never perhaps have I felt so spiritually terrified as I was during the dreadful inaction of that night. Even if I had known that I was going to be executed at dawn, I think that by comparison I should have been light-hearted. But the worst part of the business was that I knew nothing. I was like a man forced to walk through dense darkness among precipices, quite unable to guess when my journey would end in space, but enduring all the agonies of death at every step. About midnight again we heard that scuffle and stifled cry in the hut behind us. "He's gone," I whispered to Marût, wiping the cold sweat from my brow. "Yes," answered Marût, "and very soon we shall follow him, Macumazana." I wished that his face were visible so that I could see if he still smiled when he uttered those words. An hour or so later the usual fire appeared in the marketplace, round which the usual figures flitted dimly. The sight of them fascinated me, although I did not want to look, fearing what I might see. Luckily, however, we were too far off to discern anything at night. While these unholy ceremonies were in progress, the climax came, that is so far as the weather was concerned. Of a sudden a great gale sprang up, a gale of icy wind such as in southern Africa sometimes precedes a thunderstorm. It blew for half an hour or more, then lulled. Now lightning flashed across the heavens, and by the glare of it we perceived that all the population of Simba Town seemed to be gathered in the marketplace. At least there were some thousands of them, talking, gesticulating, pointing at the sky. A few minutes later there came a great crash of thunder, of which it was impossible to locate the sound, for it rolled from everywhere. Then suddenly something hard struck the roof by my side and rebounded, to be followed next moment by a blow upon my shoulders which nearly knocked me flat, although I was well protected by the skin rugs. "Down the stair," I called. "They are stoning us," and suited the action to the word. 10 seconds later we were both in the room, crouched in its further corner, for the stones or whatever they were seemed to be following us. I struck a match, of which fortunately I had some, together with my pipe and a good pocketful of tobacco, my only solace in those days, and as it burned up I saw first that blood was running down Marût's face, and secondly that these stones were great lumps of ice, some of them weighing several ounces, which hopped about the floor like live things. "Hailstorm," remarked Marût with his accustomed smile. "Hellstorm," I replied, "for who ever saw hail like that before?" Then the match burnt out and conversation came to an end for the reason that we could no longer hear each other speak. The hail came down with a perpetual rattling roar that in its sum was one of the most terrible sounds to which I ever listened. And yet above it I thought that I could catch another, still more terrible, the wail of hundreds of people in agony. After the first few minutes I began to be afraid that the roof would be battered in, or that the walls would crumble beneath this perpetual fire of the musketry of heaven, but the cement was good and the place well built. So it came about that the house stood the tempest, which had it been roofed with tiles or galvanized iron I am sure it would never have done, since the lumps of ice must have shattered one and pierced the other like paper. Indeed, I have seen this happen in a bad hailstorm in Natal which killed my best horse, but even that hail was as snowflakes compared to this. I suppose that this natural phenomenon continued for about 20 minutes, not more, during 10 of which it was at its worst. Then by degrees it ceased, the sky cleared and the moon shone out beautifully. We climbed to the roof again and looked. It was several inches deep in jagged ice, while the marketplace and all the country round appeared in the bright moonlight to be buried beneath a veil of snow. Very rapidly, as the normal temperature of that warm land reasserted itself, this snow, or rather hail, melted, causing a flood of water which, where there was any fall, began to rush away with a gurgling sound. Also we heard other sounds, such as that from the galloping hoofs of many of the horses which had broken loose from their wrecked stables at the north end of the marketplace, where in great number they had been killed by the falling roofs or had kicked each other to death, and a wild universal wail that rose from every quarter of the big town, in which quantities of the worst built houses had collapsed. Further, lying here and there about the marketplace, we could see scores of dark shapes that we knew to be those of men, women and children, whom those sharp missiles hurled from heaven had caught before they could escape, and slain or wounded almost to death. For it will be remembered that perhaps not fewer than 2,000 people were gathered on this marketplace, attending the horrid midnight sacrifice and discussing the unnatural weather when the storm burst upon them as suddenly as an avalanche. "The child is small, yet its strength is great. Behold the first curse," said Marût solemnly. I stared at him, but as he chose to believe that a very unusual hailstorm was a visitation from heaven, I did not think it worth while arguing the point. Only I wondered if he really did believe this. Then I remembered that such an event was said to have afflicted the old Egyptians in the hour of their pride because they would not let the people go. Well, these blackguardly Black Kendah were certainly worse than the Egyptians can ever have been. Also, they would not let us go. It was not wonderful, therefore, that Harût should be the victim of fantasies on the matter. Not until the following morning did we come to understand the full extent of the calamity which had overtaken the Black Kendah. I think I have said that their crops this year were magnificent and just ripening to harvest. From our roof on previous days we could see the great area of them stretching to the edge of the forest. When the sun rose that morning this area had vanished and the ground was covered with a carpet of green pulp. Also the forest itself appeared suddenly to have experienced the full effects of a northern winter. Not a leaf was left upon the trees, which stood pointing their naked boughs to heaven. No one who had not seen it could imagine the devastating fury of that storm. For example, the head of the diviner who was buried in the courtyard awaiting resurrection through our magic was, it may be recalled, covered with a stout earthenware pot. Now that pot had shattered into shards and the head beneath was nothing but bits of broken bone which it would have been impossible for the very best magic to reconstruct to the likeness of a human being. Calamity indeed stalked naked through the land. End of chapter 12.